Hi, and welcome to this week's episode of Reading the Gospels Through Hebrew Eyes. Marriage, divorce, remarriage, adultery, these are the topics that come up in Mark chapter 10, which is the reading for this coming Sunday. What I want to do is set Jesus' words in the first century Jewish context and ponder their meaning for that context as well as for our own. So what was the commonly accepted majority viewpoint with regard to divorce in first century Jewish culture? Could a man divorce his wife for any reason, or did he have to have some kind of special short list of reasons? Could a Jewish woman divorce her husband under any circumstances? Those are some of the questions we need to ask and then connect those, compare those to what Jesus has to say to us in these first few verses of Mark chapter 10. What I want to do to begin with is to set this particular section of Mark 10 within the broader context. So if you look at Mark chapter 9, verses 30 and 32, you're going to have a passion prediction. So a prediction of Jesus' upcoming crucifixion and resurrection. Then if you go to Mark 10, 32 through 34, you have another passion prediction. Sandwiched between these are several teachings of Jesus which Mark has gathered to illustrate the upside-down nature of the kingdom of God. So the first shall be last, for instance, or children are held up as the model disciples. There is this radical measure to stop sinning. That's the idea of the chopping off of hands and feet and the gouging out of eyes. There is what is the under discussion today, the topic of marriage and divorce. And then following that is Jesus' teaching on riches and treasures connected with the kingdom of heaven. Now what we see in each of these is that Jesus is taking the commonly accepted understanding of how one should live and conduct himself in the first century Jewish context, and he's flipping it upside down. So here we have several teachings about being disciples in which Jesus' first century disciples and we today are challenged to recalibrate our understanding of what is good and what is bad, what is the will of God and what is not the will of God. And of course, today's focuses especially on marriage and divorce. So what leads to this discussion? Well, let's see in these opening verses of Mark chapter 10. Jesus left there and went to the region of Judea and beyond the Jordan, and the crowds gathered to him again, and again, as was his custom, he taught them. And the Pharisees came up, and in order to test him, so this is not an innocent question, they're not simply asking, hey, what is your interpretive opinion about this? They're doing this from a sinister motivation. They ask him in order to test him, is it lawful for a man to divorce his wife? Now, let's get a feel for what the context of this particular question was and the answers that were commonly given to it in the first century Jewish culture. Let's look at 3 or 4 examples. These first two are from Josephus, who was a first century Jewish historian in the latter half of the first century. In 2 of his writings, he makes reference to the fact that a man could divorce his wife for any reason whatsoever. So in Antiquities, he says that he that desires to be divorced from his wife for any cause whatsoever, and many such causes happen among men, let him give in writing assurance he will never use her as his wife anymore. And then in his life, where he's talking about himself, Josephus says that about this time, I divorced my wife also, as not pleased with her behavior. And then he married another woman. So why was he not pleased? We're not told. And what kind of behavior displeased him? We're not told about that either, but presumably it could have been anything based upon what he says in Antiquities. Secondly, Philo, who is a contemporary of Jesus, he's a Jewish philosopher in Egypt. He's talking about Deuteronomy 24, which is a law we will look at in just a moment. And Philo says that Moses, the lawgiver, writes that a woman having been divorced from her husband under any pretense whatever, and having married another, if she becomes a widow, she can't return to her first husband. So Philo talks about a divorce that can happen under any pretense whatsoever. And then we know from later rabbinic law, so later Jewish law, so this is post-first century, that by and large, divorce was allowed, especially that which is enacted by the husband, for any reason whatsoever. Now we do know that in the first century, you basically had 2 schools of thought. You had 2 interpretive schools of thought with regard to Deuteronomy 24, which is the Torah passage about divorce. And you had kind of what we might call a majority viewpoint and a minority viewpoint. And these are represented by two famous rabbis. One is Shammai and one is Hillel. And what their difference in interpretation is revolves around this one particular phrase in Deuteronomy 24, ervat devar, which we will look at more closely in a moment. But we can kind of think of it now as indecency, kind of this generic word, indecency, whatever that might mean. So what were the two understandings or interpretations of this? Well, those who follow Rabbi Shammai said a man may divorce his wife only if he has discovered her to be sexually unfaithful to him. And of course, if you know what Jesus says in Matthew 5 and in Matthew 19, this is somewhat parallel to that, where he talks about divorce on the grounds of sexual immorality. Now, that was the minority viewpoint. The school of Hillel, which was the majority viewpoint, said that a guy could divorce his wife for any reason whatsoever. In fact, if he found another woman more attractive, or she was a better cook, and I'm not making this up, this was part of the reason, then he could divorce her. So the Hillelites understood ervat devar, this indecency, as anything unseemly. And as I mentioned already, that came to be the dominant viewpoint in first century Judaism. So that's kind of the background here. Most Jews in the first century believed that a Jewish man, not a Jewish woman, but a Jewish man could initiate a divorce for any reason, whatever that might be, whether it was sexual infidelity or whether it was that she was a bad cook or just had done something that upset him, or he found another woman who was more attractive, whatever it might be. Now, that's not uncommon for us to think about that same thing today, of course. That is the kind of the commonly accepted socially accepted common understanding of divorce today, except, of course, in our culture, a woman can also initiate a divorce for any reason whatsoever. But this kind of idea that it doesn't have to be kind of any special reason or any kind of gross violation of the marital bond, but any reason whatsoever, that was also common in first century Judaism. I accent that to make sure that we don't miss how countercultural what Jesus said was, not just in our current climate, but also in the first century. So what happens after this? Let's look at verses 3 through 5. Jesus answered them, "What did Moses command you?" So they ask a law question, they get a law answer. Jesus says, well, basically, what does the Bible say? What did Moses command? And they said, Moses allowed a man to write a certificate of divorce and to send her away. And Jesus said to them, because of your hardness of heart, he wrote you this commandment. So what law of Moses are we talking about here? Well, it's the one we have alluded to multiple times. It's from Deuteronomy 24. Here is the context. What this is basically about in Deuteronomy 24, 1 through 4 is, suppose there's a man that divorces his wife and she marries another man. Well, if he divorces her, that second man, or if he dies and she becomes a widow, can she come back to her former husband? And the answer is no. But here's the significant point in these first two verses. When a man takes a wife and marries her, if then she finds no favor in his eyes because he has found in her some ervat devar, some indecency, and he writes her a divorce certificate and sends her away, in essence, she can't come back to him as his wife. Now, what is this ervat devar? What is this? How do we translate this? How do we understand this? Well, this is what led to the two schools we talked about a minute ago. The school of Shammai, which had a very minor viewpoint, said this is in reference to sexual infidelity, and then had the school of Hillel, which said it's anything, any kind of indecency whatsoever. Well, what's this Hebrew mean? Well, ervat devar literally means the nakedness of a thing. So devar means thing or word. Ervat means nakedness. So ervat devar is the nakedness of a thing. That same phrase is found a chapter earlier in Deuteronomy 23:14, where it refers to a shameful exposure in the camp of Israel. So since ervat does mean nakedness, it's frequently used in sexual context, which suggests that Deuteronomy 24 is not talking about any reason whatsoever, any indecency, whatever that might be, but instead it is focused upon some sort of sexual indecency, presumably some kind of adultery, some kind of sexual infidelity. Now, what Jesus says is he kind of turns things around. He says, Oh yeah, you've got that law in Deuteronomy 24, and you know why you have that law in Deuteronomy 24? You know why there's a regulation with regard to divorce? Because of your hardness of heart. Because of, in Greek, your sclero-cardia. So this is used in a couple of different contexts in the Greek translation of the Old Testament, in the Septuagint. It's used in Deuteronomy 10:16 and then in Jeremiah 4:4. And in both these contexts, what's being talked about is not just kind of generic hardness of heart, but a hardness of heart connected to idolatry. That's especially the case in Jeremiah 4:4, where he says, circumcise yourselves to God and circumcise your hardened heart. Now, really what's going on here is that Jesus is saying the reason in Deuteronomy 24 Moses gave you this regulation with regard to divorce is because of what's happening inside you, because of your hardness of heart. So you see the way this works. Because their idolatrous hearts were prone to sway from the God of Israel, faith in him, then this led to a hardness of heart toward those closest to them, including their wives. So their faith toward God, being affected by their hardness of heart, impacted their love toward others. So hardness of heart to spouse. So what Jesus is saying is basically, to put it in kind of modern terminology, no-fault divorces are an impossibility. There's always fault. And Jesus would say, you know what the fault is? Hardness of heart. Sclero-cardia. That's the fault of divorces. So it all goes back to this hardening of the heart, which is caused by idolatry. So you see how everything is traced back to one's relationship to God. If that relationship is off, that impacts the heart. That lack of faith then impacts the lack of love that is exhibited toward those nearest and dearest to us, or at least those who should be nearest and dearest to us. So Jesus says that. What does he go on to say? This is verses 6 through 9. Jesus says, but from the beginning of creation. So he doesn't leave it at Deuteronomy 24. He's going to take us back now to Genesis 1 and 2. So in essence, what Jesus is doing is saying this. You know what? Instead of letting a law given because of your idol-worshiping hardness of heart tell you under what circumstances you can end a marriage, how about we go back to the beginning? How about looking instead at God's good creation of marriage and of what he has done to create a marriage? Let's talk about that. So he says, from the beginning of creation, God made them male and female. Therefore, a man shall leave his father and mother and hold fast to his wife, and the two shall become one flesh. So they are no longer two, but one flesh. What therefore God has joined together, let not man separate. Jesus is pointing us back to Genesis 1 and 2, to a couple of different passages here. So in Genesis 1, he's pointing us to verse 27. God created man in his image, in his own image. In the image of God, he created them. Male and female, he created them. So men and women, male and female, bear the image of God. That's the first verse. Secondly, Genesis 2:24, of course, this is the context of Eve being given to Adam as his wife, one made from his side. Therefore, a man shall leave his father and his mother and hold fast, cleave to his wife, and they shall become one flesh. The image from creation of God joining together, of God making these two one, of joining them as a unit, as one body, is an interesting word in Greek. So it's physiognomy. Now, physiognomy can be translated simply as joined together, but also can be translated kind of more graphically as yoked together. So what God has yoked together, this man and woman that he has yoked together as one, don't let man try to separate. So this union which God has created, do not let man attempt to uncreate, to sever. So the basic idea is this. As a head is joined to a body for life, so we don't go switching at our heads. I've got my head, you've got your head. It's a one head that we have joined to our one body for life. So as a head is joined to a body for life, so a husband is joined to his wife for life. Since God has physiognomy, has yoked them together as one flesh. Now, with all this being said, and knowing kind of the general Jewish context of the day, you can imagine that the disciples of Jesus, as all of us as well, I'm assuming, me included, as we're kind of listening to this conversation between Jesus and the Pharisees, we're like, wow, that's really contrary to a lot of what we've been taught. That's really contrary to what is kind of the overall consensus of the religious culture of the day. I'm talking about the first century, but I'm also talking, of course, about our contemporary religious culture. So you can imagine then the disciples have some questions, which they then proceed to ask Jesus, but they ask him in private. And that takes us to the next section of Mark 10, verses 10 through 12. So in the house, that is privately, away from the crowds, away from the Pharisees, the disciples ask him again about this matter. What they ask him, we're not told. Presumably they asked for greater clarification. He said to them, "Whoever divorces his wife and marries another commits adultery against her, that is, commits adultery against his wife. And if she divorces her husband and marries another, she commits adultery." Now that second statement is remarkable, as R.T. France points out. It's remarkable because it presupposes the possibility of a wife initiating a divorce, and that was not part of the Jewish law. It was part of the Roman law, but wasn't part of the Jewish law. So maybe Jesus is kind of scanning the horizon, and he's thinking more of kind of the broader Greco-Roman context and not just the Jewish context here. Now, if we know the kind of the understanding of divorce and remarriage in the Jewish culture of the first century, we could understand why the disciples, when they heard this, and this is recorded for us in the parallel version in Matthew chapter 19, when the disciples heard this, here was their response to Jesus. They said, if that's the case of a man with his wife, it's better not to marry. They were so shocked by this that they said, well, if that's going to be what happens with divorce and remarriage, well, it's better just not to marry to begin with. Of course, the logic that Jesus sets up is very clear. If a man is joined to a woman for life, a head to a body, God has yoked them together. Then if a man is joined sexually to another woman post-divorce, that's just as much adultery as if he's joined to another woman besides his wife pre-divorce. So in both cases, the understanding is that this is a lifelong union of man and woman as husband and wife, the same lifelong union that our head has with our body. Now, you might be asking yourself, is this all that the Bible has to say about divorce? No, it's not. But this is all that Mark chapter 10 has to say about divorce. In fact, it's all that the Gospel of Mark, period, has to say about divorce. You can also look at some other sections. You can look at the parallels to Mark 10 and the synoptics in Matthew 5 and in Matthew 19, where there's more of a discussion and a fuller, we might say, discussion of divorce. You can also look at the shorter version in Luke chapter 16, verse 18. Paul addresses marriage, divorce, and remarriage again in 1 Corinthians chapter 7. And there he talks about the case of abandonment, where a spouse abandons another spouse. You can check that out. And go back to the Old Testament. Jeremiah 3, very interestingly, talks about God himself divorcing his adulterous wife, the adulterous northern kingdom of Israel, which had engaged in perpetual and unrepentant spiritual adultery by worshiping the gods of the nations. So there's, of course, more to be looked at than just Mark 10 in the Bible with regard to marriage and divorce and remarriage. But that's what we have in Mark. That's Mark chapter 10. And it makes me uncomfortable. I'm sure it probably makes a lot of you who are watching this uncomfortable as well. And that's good. There's nothing wrong with that whatsoever. Many of the things that Jesus says makes us uncomfortable because it runs contrary to that which we often tend to believe, because we just kind of assume certain things because that's what we hear from society, because that's what we've been told by religious leaders, whatever it might be. Jesus is confronting us and saying, this is the way God designed things from the beginning. This is God's will. Don't be running to Deuteronomy 24 or somewhere else in the law, but go back to creation. Understand how God made man and woman in his image and bound them together because it was not good for the man to be alone. He joined them together so they're no longer two, but they are one flesh. So that what is the man's is the woman's, so that what is the woman's is the man, so that the marriage is all about our, not my and my, but our. They are joined together in a lifelong union. Now, kind of behind all of this discussion of marriage is the fact that earthly marriages are an icon, an image of the marriage between Christ and his bride, the church, which is what we should always look at with regard to any discussion of marriage. Because as Paul says in Ephesians chapter 5, marriage is ultimately about the union of Christ the bridegroom with the church, which is his bride, that he has sanctified, washed, saved, made his own. And into the church, into that body, we have been baptized. So that as those who have all manner of sins, have all manner of rebellions, made all kind of mistakes in life, we are joined then to Christ in his body, the church, so that in him we are sanctified and made his own. And that is ultimately where our eyes need to be directed, toward the marriage of God with his people, the marriage of Christ with his church. Now, you may have other questions about marriage, about divorce, about remarriage, about adultery, about all these questions, and that's fine. And what I'd encourage you to do is study the scriptures and talk with your pastor. That's the reason that God has given you a pastor, so that your pastor can shepherd you, can teach you these scriptures, can talk about your own relationships and failed relationships and all of these matters related to marriage in connection, in light of what Christ says in his word. So if you have other questions, then I encourage you to sit down with your pastor and to talk through those. But I hope this run through of Mark chapter 10 has been helpful to you, kind of set it in its context so that you can better understand really the impact and the surprising impact that Christ's words make on our understanding of marriage and of divorce. I pray that you're all well, and I pray that God's mercy and his grace and his peace may be yours in abundance. We'll see you next week.